have heard that School of Motion acquired Mograph Mentor earlier this year. You're going to see some of this previously behind a paywall content be released and accessible on schoolofmotion.com, so keep checking back here for more. Thanks!
We're going to start by looking at animation principles, but first let's talk about why we need to study this. Being a motion designer is the combination of being an animator, a designer, and a filmmaker. And we believe the best path in doing that is to deconstruct it and study them one at a time. We're going to reference one of the best examples I've ever seen of encapsulating the full 12 principles of animation into easy to understand examples. Let's take a look.
The following has been paraphrased from The Illusion of Life by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. Squash and stretch. This action gives the illusion of weight and volume to a character as it moves. Anticipation. Prepares the audience for a major action the character is about to perform. Each major action is preceded with specific moves that anticipate for the audience what is about to happen. Staging. It's the presentation of an idea so that it is clear. Straight ahead and pose to pose. Pose to pose is charted with key drawings done at intervals throughout the scene. Straight ahead animation starts at the first drawing and works drawing to the end of a scene. Follow through and overlapping. When the main body of the character stops, all other parts continue to catch up to the main mass. Nothing stops all at once. Slow in and slow out. As the action starts, we have more drawings near the starting pose, one or two in the middle, and more drawings near the next pose. Fewer drawings make the action faster, and more drawings make the action slower. Arcs. All actions, with few exceptions, follow an arc or slightly circular path. Arcs give animation a more natural action and better flow. Secondary action. It's an additional action in the scene used as a supplement of the main one in order to reinforce it and add more dimension. Timing. More drawings between poses slow and smooth the action. Fewer drawings make the action faster and crisper. Timing maintains the appearance of an object abiding by the laws of physics. Exaggeration. Remain true to reality, just presenting it in a wild or more extreme form. Solid drawings. It means taking into account forms in three-dimensional space, giving them volume and weight. Appeal. It's a quality of charm, able to please the viewer's eyes. It's the charisma of the action.
Now, we don't expect you to master all of these just by watching these examples through the first time. This is something that you're going to come back to as a motion designer for years to come, but it's important just to get it on your radar now. If you're completely new to Adobe After Effects, then this content is for you. This is a piece of software that is so incredibly important for motion designers, whether it's 2D or 3D. Really, everything at the end of the day does tend to run through After Effects for final look, final composite, final render. So in this video, I'm just going to give you an overview of After Effects, what the main panels are, how to create new compositions, how to import media, bring it into our timeline, and then make adjustments to the attributes of our layers, and then do some basic keyframing. And that should give you enough of a foundation to tackle the first assignment here in this class. So without further ado, let's go ahead and launch After Effects and jump in. So we've launched After Effects. We see this start dialog. We do see our recent projects. If you're just opening it for the first time, you won't see anything here. And then over here on the left, we just see, do we want to create a dialog where we open an existing or just start a new project? Let's just click New Project. So the first thing to note is that we can adjust this interface, and I've made a few adjustments to mine here. When we hover the mouse between two panels, we see this little slider icon appear, and it basically is going to allow us to resize any of these windows. And After Effects also gives us the ability to kind of redock panels, where we can either close a panel, undock a panel, and turn it into this here, in which we can grab it and then actually in a live dynamic way see where we want to actually dock this panel. So the entire After Effects interface is basically completely customizable, which is really incredible. Now, if you just want an absolute basic layout, we can come up to this menu here where it says Window and Workspace. And if we just come back to default, now I'm just going to go ahead and resize this a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about what these panels are. I'll draw your attention over here to the left, and this is called the Project panel. And this is where when we import elements, Illustrator art, Photoshop art, images, video clips, audio, still images, anything we bring in, as well as every composition that we create, is going to be listed here in the Project panel. So it's kind of like a big asset library for this particular project. Now, here is the main window. This is called the composition window, and we don't have a composition created yet, but a composition is similar to saying a scene, just a single timeline and sequence, kind of a single shot is what we can think of as a composition. So let's actually go ahead and create a new composition by clicking on this icon here. And we're going to be presented with all kinds of options here. First of all, composition name, which I'll just go ahead and call test, but whatever the name of your shot should be. By default, this basic tab is selected and we're immediately presented with a preset window. So if you know the kind of media output preset environment that you're working in, you can just take advantage of After Effects' presets where they'll give you frame rates, pixel aspect ratios, and then overall width and height. And then you can also just customize this. So let's take this to 1920 by 1080, a traditional HD. And on pixel aspect ratio, I want to make sure that I'm using square pixels. But again, if you have an output format that uses various kinds of, anamorphic or non-square pixel formats, then After Effects gives you that ability as well. But if you're just doing standard web content, and most of the times you're just going to be using square pixels. And then the other big one here is frame rate. Now this is totally customizable. This could be 1, this could be 100, this could be the traditional film 24, this could be the more traditional television and broadcast of 30, or it could even be something like live sports broadcast, 60 frames per second, or even 120, an ultra slow motion frames per second. Now we can just input those values there, but we also have this drop-down menu where they give you some of these classic frame rates that are most commonly used. So let's go ahead and choose 24. Now, this next value here where it says resolution, that's basically saying the composition resolution that we're going to preview when we create it. And this is something that we can change after the fact pretty easily. But by default here, it's set to quarter. We could just say, no, just give me full resolution. And then it wants to know how long you want the composition to be. And that's done via a start and an end, right? The duration here. So right now we have 6 seconds plus another 17 frames out of 24 frames. So we can change this value, and let's say we want to actually make this 16 seconds long. And then it's also going to ask us about a background color. If we just want a default color, that's fine. We can just leave that black and say OK. Now we're inside of a composition. So the next place I would draw your attention is right down here to the timeline, right? So this right here, if I grab the top of this blue playhead here, I can start to drag this around, and now you can see where we're headed. This is going to be the timeline. This is where we're going to start to stack our layers when we either import media or we create custom layers, which we'll do here in a moment. Now, within this composition, the way that we can view this, first of all, we can come over to this magnification ratio here, and right now it's 100%, but if we just want it to actually fit dynamically to this screen, we could just say, basically fit to this panel, and then if we need to make adjustments, we'll just make sure we're seeing our media at the largest possible size. Now, we also have this panel over here, which is going to take a little bit more time to go through. We won't do it now, but basically, this is a series of menus that do different things. Some of them are just giving us information. Some of them are just giving us information like audio waveforms. Some are actually full hierarchies of effects and presets that can be used. There is the Align tool, and if you're an Illustrator user, that's going to be really familiar. There's the Adobe libraries, which I rarely use. the character menu here where we create and manipulate text, paragraph, that should be pretty familiar as well. The tracker, and then some compositing tools here, visual effects tools, the content aware fill. So if you're totally new, you don't really need to know all of this yet, but it's just good to get your bearings. Now we will see over here in the project panel that our composition was created and it has our title of test, and now it's here in the project panel. So let's go ahead and actually create our first element here within this composition. I'm going to click down here in my timeline, make sure that I'm starting at 0, and then I'm going to come up to this top menu. So very quickly, this top menu is pretty simple and straightforward, and it does mirror Photoshop and Illustrator, so hopefully you have a little bit of context for what some of these icons might mean. Our basic selection tool, the keyboard shortcut, is V. Now, if we want to move the canvas around, we can hit H for the hand tool and actually reposition this within the composition. We have a zoom tool, or Z, on the keyboard, and that creates a selection area that we zoom into. I'll hit H to bring that back. Then I'll hit V to go to my selection tool. Now, these next 3 elements are grayed out because these have to do with working in 3D, which we will get to a little bit later. But we also have a rotation tool, a pan behind tool, which refers to moving the anchor point of a layer. That keyboard shortcut is Y. Now, here we have a menu of actual graphical shapes: rectangle, rounded rectangle, ellipse, polygon, and star. These are our basic tools where we can create shape layers and create masks. These are the default tools. Now we also have a pen tool, so we can create custom shapes just like we would in Illustrator. We have a type tool for working with type. This next slate of tools has more to do with rotoscoping and visual effects, having a brush, clone, and eraser when you need to actually get in there and kind of paint frame by frame. It's also next to the Roto Brush tool. So this is kind of part of After Effects' very powerful visual effects suite of tools that we're not going to get to just yet, but just so you understand what those are there for. And then we have the Puppet Position Pin tool in terms of creating puppet pins. We have this nice little submenu, and the idea here is kind of character animation, noodly animation, things that you might want to stick pins into and actually treat as an animated puppet, so that's a pretty specific tool set as well. Now, really all we need to focus on at this point is basically having the selection tool and then this menu here where we can create some shapes. So let's go in here and grab an ellipse, and then I'm just going to come back to my canvas, and you should see that your icon has changed with the ellipse tool selected. Now, if I click and hold and drag, I'm going to see a couple things happen. Number one, I'm going to see that the anchor point of the layer is actually in the center of the composition, not in the center of what I'm creating. And I'm also seeing that if I'm not holding down Shift, I'm in a free transform mode, meaning kind of the X and Y scale is all over the place. If I hold Shift, I will, like in other pieces of software, constrain that circle. So I'm holding Shift and I'm clicking and dragging to kind of manipulate this size. Now, if I want to create this shape exactly centered in the composition, I'll hit Command-Z to undo that, and I'm going to come down to this part of the composition panel that says Choose Grids and Guides, and this is where After Effects gives us kind of a layer of tools. So if I choose something like Proportional Grid, I'm going to find a center point here in the composition, which is nice, and if I do Command plus and Command minus, I can zoom in and zoom out of this composition panel. So I'm going to zoom in, and then I'm going to put this right on the center point, and I'm going to select Shift Option Command and then drag. And Shift Option Command is basically saying constrain to be a perfect circle, but scale up from the exact center. So let's go ahead and then create this. Now, by default, shape layers come in as these blue layers in After Effects, and shape layers are very powerful and basically act as containers where we could add multiple shapes within this shape layer and then also manipulate each individual shape. So there's a lot of utility in shape layers. You'll certainly be using them a heck of a lot as an After Effects user if you're doing 2D animation that's, very design driven. Now, we've created an element. It's here within our composition panel. That's one way to go about creating elements that we can start to move and manipulate and create keyframes and do animation. The other way we can do it is to import something and put it in this timeline. So I'm just going to double click here within the project panel. So I happen to have this PNG of the Instagram logo of all things. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that element in. And I did that by double clicking here within the project panel, but you can also come to the File menu and say Import File. And the keyboard shortcut there is Command I. And you Command I and it's going to bring up that import dialog. Now, it's just as easy as coming from the project panel and dragging directly into the composition, or I'm going to Command Z that, dragging right down here into the layer stack. Right down here into the layer stack within the composition. So that's one of two ways I can bring this element in. Now, there's an important distinction with After Effects that there are elements that are pixel-based and there are elements that are vector-based. An After Effects shape layer is a vector. I can scale this up infinitely and I'm not going to lose any image quality. This is not a pixel-based image. Now, this PNG here, although it looks quite nice at this scale, if I try to, I'm just going to hit S to bring up scale. If I attempt to scale this all the way up, I begin to see the image start to break down and fall apart. And I see this pixelization happening because this is a pixel-based image and it's not a vector. And so when it comes to After Effects, you can work with pixel-based images and you can work with vector-based images, and using Adobe Illustrator would be another way to bring in vector-based images. But it very often depends on what it is you're trying to do. But you do need to be aware that you can use these different media types, but they often have, different use cases depending on what you need to do. So I've got these two different media types here within After Effects, and I see these layers. And let's go back to, I hit S on the keyboard to bring up the scale property, and then I immediately have this slider where I can manipulate that, and I can click on my shape layer here and hit S to bring up scale. Now the thing you need to remember is PSR, position, scale, rotation. So let's select both of these by shift selecting both layers, and let's hit P. And this brings up position. If I hit S, it brings up scale. If I hit R, it brings up rotation. And we'll notice I can manipulate all of these. I can hit P, move that, S for scale. Position, scale, and rotation are the foundational attributes of every layer within an After Effects composition. Now, next to the word scale here, we see a little stopwatch icon, and if we hit that, it lays a keyframe. So now we're off and running, we're setting keyframes. So let's just actually create a quick animation. Let's go forward to 1 second in time, click the stopwatch on our logo, and then click the stopwatch on our shape layer. Let's go back to 0, and let's actually zero these values out. Now, because we laid a first keyframe, After Effects automatically laid these keyframes. So that's a good thing to be aware of, that once you lay a first keyframe on a specific property, like scale, then it's live. Then whenever we set another keyframe or manipulate the property again, you'll see it automatically adds a keyframe. Now, it did that on the scale property. If I select both and hit P, we'll see there's nothing on the position property. So we would need to set keyframes on the position property separately if we wanted to do that. Now, we have this animation here, and so if we want to watch this animation, instead of just scrubbing it, we need to adjust this preview area. And the keyboard shortcut is B to set the beginning of the preview area, and to set the end of the preview area, it's N. And you'll see that this faded area jumped forward, and you should be able to drag that around, and I would get used to that. You can also adjust this manually by just grabbing one edge and adjusting it like so. So this is your start and your end. Now, After Effects wants to do what's called a RAM preview. It wants to use the RAM on your computer to render a quick preview of the animation. And to cue that up, we hit Control-0 on the keyboard, and we'll see that animation is playing. So let's go ahead and extend this out to something like 2 seconds. Control 0 again. And we can see the animation playing. So that right there, I mean, if you can get to this point, then you've got a really good foundation to dive into the next levels of using After Effects. Before we go real quick though, let's go ahead and add some type to this scene because I want to talk a little bit about the type tool. So I've selected the type tool. I'm coming over here. Now I can see I get the classic type tool, icon as I hover into the composition here. And it's basically, you want to make a click. And now I've got a live type tool here within the composition. And down here, it's added this red layer that says empty text layer. Now I can just start typing. And I'll say pixels. And then I'm going to come down here and just click on the layer to deactivate the live type tool. And then I'll hit V to go back to my basic selection tool. And let's just go ahead and move this around within the composition. And then hit S on the keyboard to scale it down. And then one of my absolute favorite shortcuts here within a composition panel is Command D to duplicate a layer. So just quickly duplicate that out and say vectors. I'm going to select both of those, hit S, take that down to something like 60%. And now we've added 2 pieces of type to the scene. Now, coming back to this menu on the right here, we talked about the align tool a little bit. Let's say you've got 2 pieces of text and you really just want to be able to quickly align this. That is where the align tool comes in. So we would just want to select both of these layers down here in the comp panel. And then we should have the option here to, let's say align bottom. So now they're perfectly aligned along the bottom, and it's really that simple. So alignment is going to work great for just cleaning up 2 objects there. If we actually add a third and we select all 3, we're going to see that the bottom menu of this panel actually becomes active because this is talking about spacing in between elements. So let's say you've got 3 items here and you say, oh, how do I even out the spacing in between these? Well, that's where this menu comes in. So let's say distribute horizontally. And now that's going to align that, even out, equalize the spacing in between those 2 gaps there. So I'm just going to go back. So the alignment tools and the type tool are incredibly useful things to understand. Okay, so hopefully you found this helpful to understand a bit of the lay of the land here inside of After Effects. And now this kind of empowers you to move on to understanding keyframing and interpolation and creating smooth animation and bounces and all that fun stuff, applying animation principles inside of After Effects. So if you're totally new to AE, hopefully this helps you get over this first little hurdle. And let's move on to some more interesting and fun and magical animations. Let's move on.
If you've been watching this video and realizing you don't have any idea what some of these features do, maybe you should think about investing in a more structured way to learn After Effects. School of Motion's After Effects Kickstart is a comprehensive interactive course that will get you really comfortable working in After Effects in just a handful of weeks. Whether you're brand new or even if you've got a little bit of experience but have realized you still need to learn some of those fundamentals.
Before we can dive into After Effects and start to master the tool, we have to understand some of the underlying concepts of what the tool is trying to simulate and do for us that really comes from the historical tradition of animation in that frame-by-frame 2D way. So we need to first talk about a couple of really foundational concepts. You need to understand the 12 principles of animation that come from traditional character animation, but we want to talk about spacing and timing and looking at just 3 examples in it. And so let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at these ideas. When you're just learning animation, we need to keep this really simple. Animation is just a series of still images that exist on some kind of timeline so we can see it all play together. Now, in reality, it's just a series of still images, but when you play it all together, it looks like an animation. This is this illusion of motion. And so I'm here in Adobe Animate, and I'm gonna stop this here. And the examples that we wanna look at, we wanna drive home this big concept of spacing. Spacing simply means the distance between frames. So in each of these 3 animations, I have essentially 7 frames or 7 poses. And I put dashed lines here in my scene so you can see the exact position on each of these. And if I actually start to scrub through this, we'll see each of these drawings that I made just very quickly and roughly. This really is the essence of animation. It's about positioning individual images in such a way that when you play it, it looks like there's this illusion of motion. So this means that when frames are close together, it appears slow, and when images are further apart, when poses or frames are further apart, then that motion appears quicker or faster. And so we can essentially make things appear to move fast or slow by positioning each of our still images in such a way that we create that illusion. So that is animation. That's the big idea. If you can wrap your mind around that here at this absolutely foundational level, then when we go into After Effects, this same idea is going to apply to everything that we do, except we're going to have a graph editor and we're not going to have to draw every single image. We'll simply be able to create elements and create assets, but then apply this idea that, even though we're in After Effects, we're still working with still images that are going to be strung together as an animation. So we need to understand this idea of spacing. Now, spacing is powerful because we can tell a story with it too. On the left, the element is smashing into the final frame. So I put the frames close together at the beginning, and I eased out of that initial pose. And then you can see in just 3 frames, it quickly darts through the center and then smashes into its final pose. Now, on the center example here, we have a classic ease in, ease out, where the frames are close together on the extreme poses and then further apart through the center. And then on the right column here, we just have a classic jump where the frames are far apart on that contact, so we get all that velocity and energy, and then it eases up at the top where we see the frames get close together. So this is spacing, and it's really the foundational underpinning of all animation, even more complex, multi-layered character animation that you can begin to learn later on. It's still just the idea of where you're positioning still images to create that sense of movement. So this is extremely important to understand. You don't need to, know Adobe Animate just yet, but we just want to set this foundational concept as we jump into After Effects and start animating there.